Okay, well, welcome everyone to Pediatric Teaching for today. And as I said in the email, this is a special teaching session. We've covered a lot of subjects this year, but one subject we haven't covered is adolescent health. And I thought there'd be no one better to give a lecture about adolescent health than Dr. Mary Paiva. Now, some of you will have heard Mary's talk at the mid-year meeting recently, and I think that was a really important talk. And so I thought it would be important to have our trainees, our DCH and MEd candidates have an opportunity to hear Dr. Mary Paiva speak about adolescent health. Now, Mary is a paediatrician for those who don't know, is a paediatrician in Bougainville at the moment, and she's also the adolescent focal person for the Paediatric Society and done a lot of work in the field of adolescent health. So I'm going to make Mary the host of this meeting, and she'll be able to share her screen. And then, so thanks, Mary, for taking the time to give this this talk today to our trainees and everyone else listening. So thanks a lot, Mary.
Thank you, Prof. So I'll share my screen now. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it, Mary. Oh yeah, now it's in presentation mode, which is good. Yeah.
All right. Okay, thank you. So to focus better on the presentation, I'm just going to put my video off so that we can just focus on the screen, on the presentation. So good day, everybody. Thank you for joining me in today's Zoom on the topic on adolescent health and well-being. As Prof mentioned in his introduction, this talk was initially given at last month in Sogeri, and we felt that it's important to share this talk with a wider audience today. So when we talk about adolescent health and well-being, we need to first of all define what that period is. And so to define the period of adolescence, we're using, in this presentation, we're using the WHO definition, which gives the chronological ages of 10 to 19 years old. There are many organizations and institutions and researchers and scientists around the world that have different definitions for adolescence, the period of adolescence. Some define adolescence through pubertal maturation, some through physical development, and so forth. Mostly in recent years, the period of adolescence has been stretched out at both ends. So in the last 30 to 40 years, I'll give an example. So in the last 30 to 40 years, where pubertal maturation sort of started later, when girls were having their first menstrual periods around the age of 14, that period is now stretched back to about 12 and a half to 11. And at the other end of the spectrum, in late adolescence, that 19 years is also being stretched longer than that to about 24, 25. This is when young people are getting married very late in life. They're finding employment late in life, and they're still economically dependent on parents. So those are some, different variations of definitions, but in this presentation, we'll stick to this chronological age between 10 and 19. So looking at the population trend of adolescents, this slide is taken from the Unicef population projection 2017. It looks at the 30-year projection of what the population will be like from 2018 to 2050. So in 2018, where the world population is about 7.6 billion, it will grow to about 29% by 2050. In the total population. In children, it will grow by 3%. And in the ages between 5 and 17, there's a projected growth of about 9%. So currently, from 2018, around the world, there's about 1.2 billion adolescents around the world, and it's the population, adolescent population group is projected to grow about 9% by 2050. In PNG, the very latest population statistics that we have are from the PNG Demographic Health Survey from 2016 to 2018. And it states that our population from the ages of 10 to 19 is almost a quarter of the whole PNG population, 22.5. So we have a quarter of these children transitioning, young people transitioning from childhood to adolescence. And in the next 10 years or so, they transition from adolescence to adulthood, a quarter of them. So what does all of that mean? The adolescent population projection mean for our children? So as children transition into adolescence, as they transition into the second decade of life, they are no longer children, but they are not yet adults. And what does that mean for us as caregivers for adolescents? So a lot of our learning from medical school years and during training, a lot of the studies on adolescents that we were so focused on was mainly the physical development of adolescents, the sexual development, that looks at the sexual maturity rate, looking at the tenor staging from tenor stages 2 to 5, depending on the period of adolescent development. And then we also know about the linear accelerated growth in children, where between the ages of 10 to 17, there is a lot of bone growth. So this is a time when a lot of teenagers present to emergency departments with fracture of long bones. We see a lot of dental issues in the adolescent period during that somatic growth period, and physiological development basically is ongoing from the time a baby is born up until a mid-adolescence. So this is to do with your heart rate, your cardiac output, and all of that. So what's not sort of fully understood and what was not fully researched over the years was the brain development of adolescents. So you're looking at the neurologic development, the cognitive development, the moral development, and psychosocial development, those of which we thought were fully developed in childhood is still under development well into early 20s. So here we have a table just showing, I'm not sure if it's clear to all of you who can see it, but here's a table that's showing the different variables at different developmental stages of adolescence. So if you have a young person between the ages of 10 to 13, the sexual maturation is about 1 to 2 on the tenor stage. And the physical development in early adolescence is very different to that in late adolescence. The cognitive and moral development in early adolescence is very concrete. They don't have any of that abstract thought formation, but as they progress through adolescent period, they have abstract thought formation that is being laid down in their brains. And in the end, you have a more improved brain development at the end of adolescent period. Family is also an important component of adolescence, from early adolescence to late. In the early years of adolescence, children are they're more dependent on the family, but as they grow older, they start to establish independence away from families. PS is also an important variable in the milestones of adolescence. They become peer-oriented, and peer-orientation, peer pressures also drive social issues and psychosocial development of adolescents as they go as they transition through the period of adolescence. And one of the important changes that happens is the sexual development of adolescents. So during the time when they're in the early adolescence, they're more, they have an interest in their own sexual anatomy, and as they progress through adolescence, they seek out partners of the opposite sex and try to build relationships, intimate relationships with their peers in the same age group. So those are some basic milestones that we see in early, middle, and late adolescence. So previously, what was thought to be brain development that was usually seen and studied, and we thought that it was complete from 0 to 5 or 6 years old. That knowledge is now outdated. What we know now is that there are only two times in the lifetime of a human being that brain development is at its greatest. So the first time where you have a lot of overproduction of neurons in the brain is when a child is from the ages of 0 to 5 or 6 years old. And that is where a lot of programs around the world that we know of are focused on early child development. That's where we see a lot of people marketing companies spending a lot of time on developing colorful toys and cognitive development toys in childhood, but we don't see a lot of that for adolescents. We don't see a lot of marketing strategies for adolescent brain development, or we don't see so many areas of teaching in adolescent neurodevelopment. The second time, and the only time after childhood, that a neurodevelopment happens in the lifetime of a human being is between the ages of 10 and 25 years old. So that is when the greatest remodeling of the brain happens. After that, there is not much remodeling that happens. So newer studies in the last 20 years are now showing that neuromaturation, it continues into at least the early 20s, on average about the age of 24. So this is a give and take. So if you have if you've had a thriving childhood, if you've had no other problems in your childhood, if there were no epigenetics involved in your childhood, if there were no adverse childhood experiences that you have gone through, if you have not had any intergenerational traumas, the neuromaturation is almost complete by 22, 23. If you have any of those stresses in environment that influence your brain development, it takes a little bit longer than 24 years. So what new studies are showing is that cognitive development, it correlates to chronological age. So how our brain develops, it correlates very well with how old we are and in what stage of adolescent period we are in. And it's also very closely related to our moral development, the decisions we are making, whether we're doing the right or wrong decisions. Our psychosocial development, on the other hand, it's closely related with pubertal maturation. So if a person has an early onset of puberty, the psychosocial development is much faster. And that's why we see that girls appear much more mature psychosocially in any environment than boys do, because girls mature at least 2 years older, faster than the boys. And this part of development is greatly influenced by the environment that children live in, as well as the cultural settings that they grow up in. So we'll talk a bit more closely on what we mean by neuromaturation. So when a child is growing up from 0 to 5 or 6, and then from 10 to 19 years old, from our years of medical students studying neurobiology, we know that the brain develops from the back to the front. So from the brainstem to the cerebellum and all the way to the prefrontal cortex, which is the last part of the brain to be developed. And when it does develop, it develops from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, and it develops inside out. That's how neuromaturation happens. So we've seen that brain maturation occurs in two times in a person's life: early childhood and in adolescence. So what was not previously studied is that neuromaturation continues up until at least in the early 20s. So let's look at first, in this diagram, I've placed at least 4 different areas of the brain that are worth mentioning. So in the areas of the brain that are worth mentioning, what I'd like to highlight here is that the brain doesn't grow in a homogeneous pattern, and it doesn't grow in a linear pattern. So some parts of the brain progress that the secretory processes happen much faster and much earlier than other parts of the brain. One of those areas that develops around between the ages of 10 to 14 or 15 years old is the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum, it connects both hemispheres, between right and left hemispheres, and it's very important in language. So, and this is mostly seen in children who are trying to learn a second language. You will see that children between the ages of 8 to 14, 15, they will catch up much faster learning a second language than if you try to do it in your in adulthood. Adults are very slow. Yeah, the corpus callosum is almost fully developed by mid-adolescence. So during that time, language is placed very easily. For us as health workers, the relevance of the corpus callosum is that when you have children who present with chronic medical conditions, a lot of the time there is the neuromaturation doesn't happen at a rate that is similar to their peers. So they may be able to, although they want to express how they want to, the kind of language they want to use with their caregivers or with their teachers or with their parents, sometimes the language that they use is almost not efficient enough to express their thoughts very effectively. So that's one of the things that we need to consider in the corpus callosum. It tends to become fully developed in mid-adolescence. One of the important areas in neuromaturation that that is probably the biggest indicator for behavioral issues in adolescence is the limbic system. Primarily the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which is responsible for hormones, and amygdala for emotions. So when the amygdala is being developed between early and mid-adolescence, it's usually gut-driven. So young people often read emotions from how they feel they have seen it. So many times they could misinterpret emotions that adolescents display, and they have an incorrect response to those emotional stimuli. And the amygdala, the most important aspects of development that it deals with are usually aggression, sex, and attachment. So you will have an adolescent who is easily frustrated about certain things. There could be environmental stresses that tick an adolescent off. And because the part of the brain that's the last to develop, which is the prefrontal cortex, because it's in an immature development state at that time, some emotions such as frustration, such as heightened sexual fantasies, such as dependence or independence from caregivers and parents and teachers, some of these get misfired and misunderstood. And a lot of this is due to the limbic system being developed much earlier than the prefrontal cortex. So So when you have an adolescent whose development of the limbic system is almost reaching a full development, and then you have another part of the brain here, the ventral striatum, that sits in the midbrain. The ventral striatum, it's most of its action is to do with the neurotransmitter dopamine that's released into in times of excitation and rewarding components of the brain. So in those two areas, in the emotion system of the brain and the reward system of the brain, by the time a child is between the ages of 13 to 17, those systems of the brain are already fully functional. They are well developed. So what that means is that depending on whether or not a teenager or an adolescent receives a reward, whether it's a good reward or whether it's a bad, whatever the risk behavior is, whether it's good risk or bad risk, it won't tell the difference between the two. It will always see it as an experience. And if it's something that rewards the brain, the young person will continuously do it, irrespective of the potential consequences. And that's when the ventral striatum and the amygdala play an important role in the behavioral aspects of adolescence. Now, when those two areas are fully developed, bear in mind that the prefrontal cortex is not yet developed. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to be developed, and it takes up until, on average, 24 years for the prefrontal cortex to be developed. So if you have a prefrontal cortex whose main functions decision-making, planning, self-control, if those functions of the brain, that higher function of the brain is not well developed, you have adolescents who are having this reward system that's already in full development, the emotional system that it's in full development, but it's not propagated well by the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is still very immature, and so a lot of their judgment will be very poor in terms of the decisions that they make. So that's a part of the at least the 4 areas of the brain that I wanted to place focus on. What we also know about the global brain secretory processes is that there is increased myelination from childhood to adolescence, and the myelination processes start to reduce by adulthood, and then there is a process called increased synaptic pruning. In early childhood, there is a lot of synapses in the brain, in almost all parts of the brain, as the brain grows from the back to the front and from the inside out. In adolescent period, the increased synaptic pruning means that the parts of the brain that we do not have a lot of physical use of, so if we're not doing a lot of reading books, if we're not doing a lot of exercise, if we're not playing an instrument, and we don't do those things repeatedly, the synaptic pruning goes on to prune the parts of the brain that are deemed not useful. And we carry those aspects of our brain development into adulthood. And that's why it's important that as caregivers, we also, and as parents of teenagers and educators, we ensure that young people, while they're in the adolescent period, that we guide them, give them the safety net that they need to ensure that synaptic pruning happens in the right place, so that by the time they reach their adult lives, they are thriving. So with a prefrontal cortex that's still immature in adolescence, what does that mean for legal implications of a teenager if a teenager is being charged for crimes while that part of the brain is being developed? In PNG context, we look at the legal issues surrounding juvenile justice and what that means for us now that we know what we know in the last slide that I have shown. The age of criminal responsibility in PNG is 10 years. I've gone back and had a look at some of these acts of Parliament, and it's stated in the Juvenile Justice Act 2014 that any person above the age of 10 will be held criminally responsible for acts of crime that happen. So as we know, at 10 years old, there is barely any neuroplasticity of the brain that happens. Neuroplasticity of the brain happens, the prefrontal cortex starts to take shape around 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and so forth until 24 years. So at 10 years old, there is no judgment that this child can stand on to say whether his or her behaviors are culpable by law. The age of consent for HIV test is 12 years, and that's universal. And the HEMP Act 2003 states that as well. The age of consent for medical procedures without parents or guardian knowledge or permission is 16 years. 16 years is an appropriate age, as more of, given that if a child grows up in less stresses in environment, he or she is able to make those decision making at 16 years old. Age of HIV service access is that's also universal. It is unlawful to deny condoms, so HIV prevention at any age. And then there's this other act, sex between consenting minors. 12 to 16, 12 years, if not more than 2 years age difference between the two. The Criminal Code Act 1974, Section 229F. This also probably needs to be looked at because if you have a young person at the age of 12, 12 is still, pubertal maturation is still around 1 to 2. At 1 to 2 stage. A lot of cognitive development doesn't really fully happen around that age. And it's very easy for perpetrators to drag that 12 years down to 11 and 10 and 9 years and so forth. So continuing, the age of marriage in PNG is 18 years. This is taken from the age of sexual consent at the top is 16 years. Age of marriage is 18 years. Termination of pregnancy. This hasn't been amended. It still stays the same, the Criminal Code Act 1974. And male homosexual sexual activity is illegal for all ages, it says. And again, this has not been amended as well. I've looked at the new Criminal Code Sexual Offences and Crime Against Children Act 2002, and there's no mention of that there. Sexual development is still happening in an adolescent, in adolescence, and where there is sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender roles are still being laid down. They are not fully established during the adolescent period. And so the last legal framework, legal issue, male homosexual sexual activity, in my point of view, it needs to be looked at, and possibly we need clarification on that as well as a society. So, so we've looked at how the brain development hinges on risk-taking and reckless behaviors. So in the next few slides, we'll be concentrating on how behaviors shape health, the health of an adolescent, and how that is different to when children transition from childhood to adolescence with pre-existing medical conditions. So in adolescence, this is the first period of life where major determinants of morbidity and mortality are behavioral rather than congenital or infectious. In developed parts of the world, they have they have a good handle on management of disease and chronic illnesses when children transition from childhood to adolescence. In LMICs like PNG, we still grapple with both of these health spectrum. We have teenagers who are engaging in risky behaviors that result in long-term medical consequences. And we also have children with pre-existing medical conditions transitioning into the adolescent period with their conditions. So we'll talk about those in the next few slides. So,
I'm sorry, Mary, I think the meeting is going to run out, actually. I don't know why, but it's asked for me to upgrade to Pro.
Less than 1 minute.
Yeah, less than 1 minute. So I wonder if everybody could go off the meeting when it runs out and then just come back into the meeting. I think it'll probably work the next time. And would that be okay if you leave the meeting and then we come back straight to it? I think that will probably work. I'm sorry about this. I don't know. It never happened before that it's cut out at 40 minutes.
All right. But the bandwidth is holding, I hope.
Yeah, the bandwidth is really good, Mary. We're hearing everything you say. So if you've got more than, you know, a bit 5 minutes or 10 minutes to go, let's everybody leave the meeting and then come back straight to it. And I think it'll probably work for another 40 minutes.